I still remember that morning in Chicago so vividly, walking onto the 34th floor of Meridian Transit Systems. The space was familiar, the glass walls, the cold white light, the steady clatter of keyboards pulsing like the heartbeat of some enormous machine. Meridian wasn't the kind of place where people strolled. Everyone was always racing against time because we weren't just a logistics company. We ran the automated freight coordination platform that kept half the country moving. Every day, tens of thousands of trucks, containers, and warehouses depend on Meridian's software to stay on schedule. I used to joke with Milo, the young IT kid with the heavy glasses, that if someone accidentally shut the system down for 5 minutes, the entire nation would panic. He always laughed shyly, scratching his head as he adjusted his frames. He wasn't great with people, but he was kind, and in a place as stratified as Meridian, kindness was rare. And then there was me, Julia Torres, 32, executive secretary to the leadership suite. 7 years in this job had turned me into part of the background, like a shadow everyone saw but never really noticed. I used to be a law student, obsessed with contract law and compliance, until life veered off course when my mother fell ill. I left school to take care of her and took the first stable, low risk job I could find. People looked at me and saw a secretary. But I never saw myself that way. My habits never died, the habit of reading every line of a contract, every appendix, every comma and period. I knew how to analyze risk, spot loopholes, and see mismatched phrasing that most people, including people with higher titles, didn't bother to notice. At Meridian, titles were sacred. If you didn't have one, you were considered lower tier. Some employees even used the phrase downstairs literally. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone understood. The power struggle here was subtle but sharp. Everyone played their role and stayed inside their lines. I got used to that. No one expected a secretary to point out flaws in a multi-million-dollar contract. No one expected me to understand the freight algorithms that took the engineering team 2 years to build. I knew that. But I also knew that silence could be more dangerous than speaking up, especially when your voice is the one people least expect. Our new CEO, Brandon Hale, was the kind of man whose presence could quiet a room instantly. 41, always perfectly groomed, designer suits tailored like armor, and a demeanor built for spotlights. Brandon didn't fear attention. He fed on it. Everyone knew he had failed a major deal at his previous company, a mistake that stained his reputation. Some said that was why he always had something to prove, why he needed to win at any cost. I didn't hate him, but the tension he carried into every meeting was impossible not to feel. Below him stood Colton Ward, the CFO. Colton was the type of person who bowed to exactly one man, and that man was Brandon. He worked tirelessly to prove his loyalty, even when no one asked him to. I once watched him revise a slide deck 20 times just to make Brandon happy. I didn't particularly like him, but I understood why people like him existed. This system rewarded obedience, not talent. And then there was Emily Rhodes, the youngest in house attorney. Smart, sharp, and constantly trapped between doing the right thing and bending under leadership pressure. I respected her. We weren't close friends, but I knew she had more professional integrity than most of the management floor combined. That day, I was preparing the binder for a major meeting about the AeroLink acquisition. It was the biggest deal since Brandon became CEO, $85 million, and it would expand Meridian into the Pacific Northwest. I arranged each section, color tabbed every division, part habit, part instinct, because something in the operational algorithm appendix didn't sit right with me. It was a feeling I'd learned after years of digging through contracts. Not intuition exactly, but a mix of memory, logic, and paying attention to what other people ignored. I flipped to Appendix 4, the part describing long-standing usage rights for AeroLink's freight coordination algorithm, developed 20 years ago. One loose phrase, one hyphen that didn't match the formatting elsewhere, one vague footnote that made me pause longer than I meant to. The more I read, the clearer it became. It wasn't harmless. If interpreted a certain way, that clause could become a massive liability. I held my breath, rereading the entire paragraph. Everything about it felt like something that had slipped through the earlier reviews. I closed the folder gently, trying not to panic. But I knew what I'd just seen. Something real, something big, something that, if I were right, could destroy the entire deal Brandon was staking his career on. I walked to the window and looked out over Chicago. The city moved as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was steady. But for me, that single line of text told me one thing with absolute clarity. Tomorrow would not look like today. I stayed there, staring at that sprawling maze of a city, its motion hypnotic, and for a moment, I thought of you. Yes, you listening to this story. Maybe you've stood in some office somewhere, feeling underestimated or dismissed. If you have, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment. Every story has a real human behind it. And if you enjoy revenge that cuts quite sharply, like a cold blade, don't forget to follow. You won't want to miss what comes next. When I walked into the conference room on the 34th floor that morning, something in the air was already off. The long wooden table stretched across the room, polished to such a shine that it caught every strip of light from the ceiling fixtures. The LED screen up front displayed market charts for the freight industry, green and red curves blinking like they were beating in rhythm with Meridian Transit System's restless ambition. The dark roast coffee smell drifted through the room, familiar yet heavy, the kind of scent that signaled a major meeting was moments away. I set the binder at the end of the table and quietly moved into my usual spot, half hidden behind Brandon's chair. Brandon Hale entered like a gust of authority. He walked fast, decisive, undoing the top button of his suit jacket as he moved. The entire room fell silent, a reflex everyone had mastered. Brandon didn't look at anyone in particular. He swept his gaze across the room as if checking that every pair of eyes was on him. I saw Colton Ward, the vice president of finance, straighten instantly and open his laptop as if prepping for battle. The others stiffened too. Everyone knew Brandon had staked his career on the AeroLink deal. Brandon stood near the screen, clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared. AeroLink acquisition flashed in the center, followed by the number $85 million. Brandon wore that familiar confident smile, the same one he used during press-covered signings. He began talking about market potential, expansion into the Seattle corridor, and how Meridian could become the national leader in automated freight coordination. His words came at a steady pace but carried the weight of expectation. I knew he had rehearsed this speech more than once. When he moved on to the algorithm portion, I saw the slide containing an excerpt from Appendix 4, the very section I had reviewed carefully the night before. A sharp sting went through my chest. Brandon emphasized that AeroLink's coordination algorithm was stable, validated, and perfectly aligned with Meridian's expansion strategy. That statement wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't entirely right either. There was something he either didn't know or didn't care to know. I stayed silent until Brandon finished and asked the room if there were any questions. No one spoke. I took a breath, stepped forward, and let my voice come out low but clear. I said I had noticed something unusual in the algorithm appendix. I even cited the exact clause and the footnote I was concerned about. The room turned toward me. Some faces showed mild shock, not because I was wrong, but because they were not used to hearing a secretary speak during a strategy meeting. Brandon stayed silent for 2 seconds, and I knew exactly what was coming. He let out a soft laugh, one corner of his mouth lifting. He repeated my words, almost like retelling a joke. Appendix algorithm, Julia. Then he looked directly at me and tilted his head slightly. And you understand contract law better than AeroLink's engineering team. His voice was not loud, but the way he said it chilled the entire room. Colton laughed too, immediately and awkwardly, the kind of laugh that belonged more to loyalty than amusement. A few others bowed their heads, pretending to focus on laptops that were showing nothing. None of them would speak up. None of them wanted to risk eye contact. Even looking at me felt like stepping outside the invisible lines Brandon drew. Brandon shook his head lightly, then delivered the sentence I know I will remember for the rest of my life. I pay you to support the work, not to think for me. In the frozen silence of that room, his words landed harder than anything I had felt in years. My ears burned. 18 people heard him clearly. Someone let out a quiet sigh, not out of sympathy, but because they understood Brandon was issuing a warning to everyone present. I stood straight, refusing to shrink even as my chest tightened. I wasn't angry enough to argue. I wasn't weak enough to cry. I just felt a cold line run down my spine. Sometimes silence is heavier than defiance. Brandon turned away from me as if I had never existed. He continued outlining the post acquisition roadmap, the board approval timeline, and the operational transition. No one looked at me again. I returned to my spot, quiet as a shadow, but the words were still echoing inside me. I don't pay you to think. I knew that line wasn't just meant to belittle me, it was a declaration. To Brandon, I had no right to understand, no right to question, no right to participate in anything beyond clerical tasks. He dismissed the mind I had built through years of studying law, erased the capability I still carried, even if no one else acknowledged it. And right in that moment, something in me shifted, not pain, awareness. Brandon wanted my silence. But that silence made me think even more about the clause he ignored. I wasn't just underestimated, I was invisible, and that was something I knew I could not let continue. I left the conference room feeling like someone had packed stones into my chest. Brandon's words stayed with me the entire afternoon, circling my mind every time my eyes drifted to the Arrow Link binder on my desk. I tried to focus on my usual tasks, but each time I cleaned that stack of documents, my heartbeat kicked up again. When the clock neared 6 in the evening and people on the floor began packing up, the office lights shifted into their softer night mode. I stayed seated, unmoving. Something inside me refused to let the appendix go. Not as a secretary, as someone who understood exactly what she was reading. When the last footsteps faded down the hallway, I stood, closed the door, and let the quiet settle around me. The silence was so deep I could hear the hum of the air system. The warm desk lamp spilled gold across the papers, making the whole room feel like it had narrowed down to just me and the thick contract on the table. I sat again, opened the AeroLink file, and flipped through each page slowly, more deliberately than before. When I reached the algorithm appendix, I stopped. That paragraph was still there, harmless to anyone reading on autopilot, but glaring to someone who knew contract law. I traced the line with my finger, reading each word as if decoding a hidden message. The appendix described an algorithm AeroLink had built more than 20 years ago and mentioned a past licensing partnership with a small company called Vector Path Technologies, which dissolved after 5 years. I paused, feeling my pulse drop for a beat. If Vector Path had dissolved, most of its licensing rights would have expired over time. But what chilled me was the footnote at the bottom of the page. It stated that the right to use the algorithm could be renewed by any third party with sufficient technical capability, as long as they submitted a symbolic filing fee and followed the federal commercial notice requirements of that era. The fee was $5. I flipped to the next pages searching for confirmation. A small line on the following page stated that this clause had never been voided. AeroLink had changed ownership several times, but the core license remained tied to the original contract structure. If a third party submitted a valid renewal before Meridian's acquisition closed, they could claim the foundational license to the algorithm. What did that mean for Meridian Transit Systems? Without that software, the entire deal would collapse. Worse, if the license was frozen or disputed, the acquisition would halt instantly. Brandon would take the fall, and the company's reputation would take a direct hit. I leaned back and let out a long breath. The floor was empty. There was no one I could turn to. But I knew I could not stay silent the way Brandon wanted. I reached for my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and called Rosie. Rosie was a friend from law school, now working in compliance at a major corporation in Minnesota. If anyone could tell me whether this was legally sound, it was her. Rosie picked up after 2 rings. I explained the situation in broad strokes, careful not to mention company names or identifying details. When I reached the part about the $5 fee, Rosie went quiet for a few seconds. Then she sighed softly and said the sentence I both hoped for and feared. That is completely legal. If the clause was never nullified during transfers, anyone can renew the license. That is a serious oversight by the seller. The room felt colder. I set my phone down, my understanding of the entire acquisition flipping inside out. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts. On the one hand, this could protect the company from a disastrous deal. On the other hand, stepping into this meant going head to head with Brandon, and no one would stand with a secretary in a fight like that. Was I afraid? Yes. I was scared of losing my job, of being branded a saboteur, of being turned into an outcast. But the fear was no longer stronger than everything else rising inside me. I remembered the day I left law school. I remembered the hollow feeling of letting go of a dream because life had given me no other choice. I spent years at Meridian trying to fill that void, trying to prove to myself that I still understood the law, still knew how to analyze, still had the mind I once took pride in. But I never had the chance to show it, until now. I opened my eyes and stared at the file on the table, then at the computer in front of me. The fear of losing my job suddenly felt small compared to the thought of letting the company walk straight into disaster. I knew Brandon would never believe me. He would always see me as someone who served his agenda, nothing more. But that no longer mattered. I stood, gathered every document I needed, my fingers trembling, not from doubt, but from resolve. In that quiet office, with only dim lights and the low hum of machines around me, I made a decision I never thought I would be brave enough to make. I would act, and once I started, there would be no turning back. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen. Chicago's early light was colder than I expected, my breath forming pale clouds in front of my mouth. I pulled on my coat, grabbed the file I had spent all night preparing, and stepped out of my small uptown apartment. My footsteps pressed softly into the dew on the sidewalk as the first bus of the day roared past, sending a ribbon of cold wind across my face. The city felt half asleep, and there I was, moving forward with a decision I still could not believe I had found the courage to make. I walked toward the notary's office near River North. The familiar route felt longer than usual, each coffee shop unlocking its doors, each burst of laughter from staff setting up for the morning, making me wonder if I was stepping into something far too big for someone like me. But every time Brandon's dismissive stare replayed in my mind, I tightened my grip on the file. Not out of spite, but because I knew I was right. What I saw was not imagination, and if I stayed silent, no one else would speak. When I arrived at the notary's office, I took a deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, the quiet was so gentle it felt like I had stepped into a small used bookstore. The room held the smell of paper, wood, and strong coffee. The elderly notary sat behind her desk, wearing half-frame glasses, writing something with a fountain pen. When she heard the door, she looked up with sharp, clear eyes that contrasted with her warm appearance. I set the documents on the counter and explained that I was filing to renew the algorithm license under AeroLink's old clause. She lifted each page, her eyebrows rising slightly as she read. When she reached the $5 fee, she set her pen down and looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are you sure this is worth it?" The question landed softly, but hit straight at the center of my chest. I was not sure. No one could be sure. But the only thing I knew was that if I did nothing, the deal would move forward as if everything were perfect, while the flaw stood in plain sight. I nodded. "I am sure." She looked at me for another moment, then sighed the way someone sighs when they understand more than they are told. She stamped the documents, took the $5 bill from my hand, and signed the confirmation. The sound of the stamp echoed through the small room like a verdict. Short, sharp, final. From that second forward, legally speaking, I was the holder of the renewed license rights to the AeroLink freight algorithm, the very asset Meridian was paying $85 million to acquire. My legs trembled for a moment, not from fear, but from realizing the true scale of what I had just done. I stepped out of the notary office, sat on a nearby bench, and pulled out my phone. I photographed every page that had been stamped and emailed them to my personal account in case the documents were deleted or access was blocked. I saved another copy to an external drive. After years at Meridian, I knew that being right did not always mean being protected. Work passed uneventfully that day. No one knew what I had done. I still made coffee for the conference room, sent meeting invites, and answered questions from the vice presidents. I kept my face steady, but inside me was a silence stretched so tight it felt like it could snap. The first day passed with nothing happening. The second day remained quiet. By late afternoon, I started doubting myself. Maybe I had misread the clause. Maybe the filing did nothing. Maybe I had turned this entire situation into something bigger than it was. I tried to calm myself, but every time Brandon walked by with that unshakable confidence, The doubts inside me pulled taut like a fraying wire. The third day, everything changed in minutes. At around 9:15 in the morning, I was typing an operations summary when the glass door of the CEO's office slammed open so hard it bounced against the wall. The attorney overseeing the AeroLink deal, a man always composed and precise, rushed inside like the building was on fire. I had never seen him like that. From my desk, I watched Brandon's face drain of color. His breath hitched, his eyes widened, and the confidence he carried evaporated as the attorney whispered something into his ear. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. The look on Brandon's face told me everything. The news was spreading faster than I expected. Minutes later, Colton Ward stormed down the hallway with the expression of someone who had just lost an entire financial database. He questioned employees one by one, desperate to find out who had caused the license freeze. He moved so fast he almost bumped into me, but he only glared and kept going, as if I were a piece of furniture in his way. At the same time, Milo stepped out of IT, phone in hand. As he passed me, he lowered his voice just enough so no one else could hear. Internal meeting just finished. They said the deal cannot be signed because someone filed for the license. I nodded slightly, pretending I did not fully grasp what he meant. But inside, a wave rolled through me. Not joy, not triumph, but clarity as bright as daylight. My action had struck the deepest part of the deal, and now everything was moving beyond the point of return. I stayed silent. I stayed exactly where I always stood, just another background figure in the company. But for the first time in years, I did not feel invisible. I felt like I was holding something larger than myself, something Meridian and Brandon would be forced to confront. The morning the deal began to unravel, I had just set my coffee on the desk when the internal phone rang. Brandon Hale's name flashed on the screen. There was no greeting, no polite lead-in, just four cold words through the line. Come to my office now. When I walked in, Brandon stood by the window with his back to me. His shadow stretched across the floor, sharp and rigid under the cut of the morning light. The usual arrogance was gone. So was the confident smile he wore in every meeting. What remained was a suffocating tension, as if the room had suddenly become too small for a man with an ego his size. He turned. One look at his face, and I knew he already understood everything. He did not invite me to sit. He just braced his hands on the large walnut desk and lowered his voice. Julia, I want you to withdraw the filing immediately. I stayed silent for a few seconds. Brandon continued, his tone dropping even further, each word sharpened. If you do not, I can guarantee you will have no future at Meridian. It was not a shout. It was a very American kind of threat, the kind wrapped in professional etiquette, but edged with a blade sharp enough to sever someone's entire career. I drew in a quiet breath. I did not shake. I did not lower my eyes. I told him calmly that I could not withdraw anything because I had filed it legally, as an individual, under a valid clause in the contract, and I reminded him that I had tried to warn him in the meeting. He simply refused to listen. Brandon stared at me as if he could not comprehend why a secretary would ever stand upright in front of him. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh, but the brittle kind people use when they are about to lose control yet still want to pretend they hold all the power. His voice sharpened to ice. You seem to forget your place here. I can make every door in this industry slam shut on you. I answered simply. I know exactly what my place is, and I know the limits of the clause. I have done nothing wrong. I caught the twitch at the corner of Brandon's eye. He was furious, truly furious, but forced to maintain a corporate tone, because the moment he crossed the line, it could become evidence against him. He said nothing more. He just flicked his hand toward the door, dismissing me like someone waving away polluted air. When I stepped back into the hallway, I took a long breath. Right then, an email notification flashed across my phone. Internal investigation notice. Reason: interference with acquisition processes, conduct misaligned with job responsibilities. I almost laughed. HR always moved fastest when protecting an executive, not the company, not the truth, the executive. Less than 10 minutes later, when I reached my desk and touched my keyboard, a warning filled the screen. Access restricted. The IT department locked this device per executive request. I knew Milo had not done it. That order came from the top, passed down to another technician. Milo might be clumsy, but he was fair. He would never lock someone out because the CEO was angry. I did not panic. I took out my phone and photographed the entire restriction notice as evidence. A moment later, the phone rang again. Emily Rhodes, the in-house attorney, was calling me to her office. When I walked in, Emily was sitting straight-backed, hands clasped, her expression measured. Unlike Brandon, her eyes were not sharp, but they carried a warning. Julia, we need to talk about the filing. It seems you have complicated things. I cannot say much, but you need to understand the company is in a very sensitive position. I told her every action I had taken was legal and that I filed under my personal capacity as allowed by federal commercial law. Emily held my gaze for a long moment, as if she wanted to say more but could not. In the end, she gave me only one sentence. Be careful. None of this is simple. When I stepped back into the hallway, it felt longer than usual. Several vice presidents looked at me with distance, some avoiding eye contact entirely. People who once asked me to schedule their meetings or assemble their presentations now behave as if they had never spoken to me. Only Colton bothered to approach. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, wearing a half smile that was more sneer than anything else. Who do you think you are, Julia? You just sabotaged the biggest deal this company has ever had. I hope you understand who will suffer the consequences. I said nothing. No fear, no trembling. I just looked directly at him and saw it clearly, the blend of arrogance and panic. Colton was not angry about the filing itself. He was angry that the deal might fail and his own position would fall with it. I turned away without offering a single word. In my small office, I took out my phone and began saving everything: emails, meeting notes, timestamps, and photos of every retaliatory action the company had taken within hours. I organized it all into a folder prepared for my private attorney. When I hit send, I knew I had stepped into a game Brandon never imagined I would dare to play. By the end of the day, I collected my things and walked out of the Meridian building. The Chicago wind cut across my face, sharp and freezing, but I stood tall. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not shrink. I looked up at the gray sky and understood that everything had passed the point of return. Brandon had made his move. And now I was ready to make mine. I did not sleep that night. After leaving the building, all I wanted was to walk fast toward my apartment and peel myself away from the pressure building behind me. But once the door closed and I sat at my desk, there was only one thing I knew with absolute certainty. I could not stand still and wait for Brandon to crush me under the weight of his power. I opened my personal laptop and sent an urgent email to my attorney, Mark Henderson, the one I had consulted briefly before filing the license renewal. I attached everything: the HR investigation notice, the IT lockout screenshots. The meeting notes show the exact moment Brandon ignored my warning. The contract review summary with Rosie. I even included the precise wording of Brandon's subtle threat. Mark called me back in 7 minutes. His voice was steady, measured, not even close to panicked. After I told him everything, he said a single sentence that felt like someone had draped armor over my shoulders. Julia, from this moment on, you are a federal-level whistleblower. We are filing for retaliatory action protection first thing in the morning. I exhaled sharply, tension sliding off me in pieces. We drafted the whistleblower protection request within 2 hours, listing every retaliatory act taken by the CEO and HR. Mark submitted it that night, and a copy was delivered to Meridian's legal department by 7 the next morning. By 9, I received an email from HR. Notice: internal investigation on hold. Reason: review of legal risk per request from external counsel. I set my phone down and let a rare moment of quiet settle over me. But that calm did not last. Around 10, the 34th floor hallway started shifting. People who normally never looked in my direction were now watching from a distance, their eyes curious and uncertain. Conversations behind glass panels grew louder, sharper. Something was spreading across the office, but it was no longer centered on me. It was centered on Brandon. I heard 2 mid-level managers talking by the elevators. Why did he ignore the warning in the first place? Why did he not let legal review the appendix? You think the board will let this slide? For the first time, I heard multiple people asking the same question. Whose fault is this? Really? When I passed the hallway, Brandon stepped out of a meeting room. He no longer looked polished. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie skewed, and the bags under his eyes were unmistakable. As the door behind him opened, I heard Colton trying to calm him, his voice shaky. Brandon, you need to relax. We can fix this if. I did not hear the rest because Brandon cut him off with a voice on the verge of breaking. She is a secretary. How could she possibly cause this? He said it low, but loud enough for me to hear through the thin glass. I paused. The walls were never as soundproof as executives like to believe. Brandon was unraveling. Emily appeared from the left corridor and motioned for me to follow her. As soon as her door closed, she sighed, set her glasses down, and spoke in a quieter tone. Julia, I don't have much to say, but I need you to understand this. You are not wrong. But you must be extremely careful. The way she said it made everything clear. This fight was not just legal. It lived inside Meridian's invisible structures of power, and anyone who challenged the CEO risked being crushed if they were not prepared. By midday, the tension in the office thickened. Sideways glances, closed-door meetings, a sudden email summons that only managers could see. Staff rushing in and out of the legal department like an internal investigation had erupted behind those doors. At 3 in the afternoon, the secrecy fractured. The secretary of one board member came down to my floor, her expression tight. She whispered as she passed my desk. The board ordered Brandon to submit a full explanation. They are all on 40 right now. I looked at her, saying nothing. But I knew. This was the turning point. In Meridian, when the board demanded an immediate explanation, it meant the issue was serious enough to threaten finances, operations, or reputation. And the fact that they called the CEO up on the spot meant only one thing: they were beginning to doubt him. 20 minutes later, shouting echoed from a closed conference room near the executive wing. I could not make out each word, but Brandon's voice was unmistakable. It was no longer cold authority. It was panic, rage, and desperation. Julia messed up everything. She exploited the loophole. She is threatening the entire company. He was trying to shift blame, to turn me into a danger so he could save himself. But I also knew something else. His words did not carry the same weight anymore, because this time the truth was not on his side. I returned to my desk and opened the personal file where I stored everything. 3 copies, saved to an external drive, my email, and Mark's private folder. I reread every line, every note, every screenshot. The more I read, the steadier I felt. I had done nothing wrong, and everything I did followed federal procedure. I sat there with my hand resting lightly on the stack of documents, my mind calm in a way that surprised me. Brandon could yell, threaten, twist the narrative any way he wanted. But for the first time since I stepped into Meridian, I had something he did not: truth, law, and evidence. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer the one waiting to be crushed. I had entered this game prepared, and this time I was not standing alone. The call summoning me to the 40th floor came the next morning while I was preparing briefing materials for the operations team. The voice of the board's assistant was short and flat, as if announcing an ordinary meeting. But nothing about that call was ordinary. The 40th floor of Meridian belonged to closed-door discussions, decisions that could move the entire company and sometimes even the market. I had never stepped into that space as someone presenting information. I entered the elevator, feeling both heavy and strangely light. When the doors opened on the top floor, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Quiet, sterile, cold like a surgical theater. Soft gold lights reflected across the polished floor. I followed the wide hallway to the frosted glass doors where the board was waiting. When the doors slid open, I realized immediately that this was nothing like any meeting room I had ever seen. A large oval table anchored the center. 8 board members sat in a precise arc, their expressions carved in stone. No one smiled. The air felt thick enough to press against the lungs. Brandon sat at the far end, directly facing the entrance. He looked worse than the day before. Red eyes, deep shadows under them, the exhaustion of someone who had not slept at all. His suit was still immaculate, but the confidence was gone. When I stepped inside, he glanced at me briefly, his expression carrying both fatigue and a fury waiting for a spark. Richard Monroe, the board chair, gestured toward an angled seat to his right. His voice was steady and impartial. Julia Torres, thank you for being here. We need to hear directly from you regarding the events surrounding the AeroLink acquisition. I nodded and rested my hand on the folder I had prepared. My heart beat hard, but my voice did not shake. I started from the beginning. From the moment I noticed the irregular clause in the algorithm appendix. From the moment my warning was dismissed and turned into humiliation. I described reviewing every page that night, calling Rosie to verify the legal implications, and filing the license renewal under my personal capacity in full compliance with federal commercial law. Then I outlined the immediate retaliation, the HR investigation, the IT lockout, and Brandon's thinly veiled threat in his office. I said all of it with a calmness I did not know I possessed, maybe because by the time I walked into that room, I understood I had nothing left to lose. When I finished, the board began asking questions, not personal attacks, but sharp, precise inquiries about procedure, evidence, timelines, and law. I answered each one directly, without exaggeration, without avoidance. I placed copies of everything I had sent to Mark on the table. The room listened without shifting, without impatience, until Brandon spoke. She sabotaged the deal. She tried to seize control of a company asset. She disrupted operations at the exact moment we were close to signing. His voice cracked with anger, but as he tried to recast the narrative with me as the threat, I noticed the subtle change in a few board members' eyes. The unquestioning trust was gone. They wanted proof, not emotion. Richard folded his arms and turned to Brandon. Do you have any evidence that Ms. Torres acted with personal motive? Brandon opened his mouth, but he could not provide anything specific. He repeated that I overstepped, that I lacked the expertise, that I had caused the current crisis. And that was when Emily Rhodes stood. Her voice was not loud, but clear enough to cut through the room. I would like to clarify. Julia's warning was correct. The license clause in the algorithm appendix is real and legally enforceable. Without that warning, the acquisition was at significant risk of collapsing post-signing. Silence poured across the room. No one had expected Emily to speak because doing so meant placing herself directly across from the CEO. But her expression did not waver, no hesitation. Colton jumped in immediately, trying to rescue Brandon. She is just a secretary. How can we let a secretary's misunderstanding derail a major acquisition? This time, his words worked against him. A board member turned toward him and asked, if she is just a secretary, then why was she able to catch a clause your entire team missed? Colton had no answer. He stuttered, then fell silent. Richard looked around the table, letting his gaze settle on each face before speaking. And when he finally did, he delivered the sentence I knew Brandon had never imagined hearing. After reviewing all relevant facts, the board has agreed that CEO Brandon Hale is to be suspended immediately pending internal investigation. Brandon shot up from his chair, his voice cracked. You are choosing to believe a secretary over me. No one answered. No one needed to. I looked at him, not triumphant, not joyful, just quiet. His eyes held shock, disbelief, and something that looked very close to despair. Maybe for the first time in his ambitious career, he was being forced to face the truth. The person he considered invisible was the one who brought the entire wall of power crashing down. And that boardroom, cold and solemn as a courtroom, witnessed that moment more clearly than anyone else. The morning after the board meeting, Meridian felt like a massive organism that had just survived an earthquake. Everything looked the same, but the air was completely different. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew Brandon Hale's career had ended in less than 2 hours. Around 10, while I was standing near the reception, the elevator doors slid open. Brandon stepped out, holding a cardboard box, the same kind used by employees on their last day. Inside were scattered books, a photo frame, a navy ceramic mug, and a few papers. His face held no tension. The power and confidence he once carried so easily were gone. He walked fast, eyes fixed on the main exit. No one walked beside him. No escort. No applause. No polite farewell. No basic respect for a CEO once celebrated as the man steering the company forward. Only a few quiet glances trailed him from distant desks. I stood only a few steps away. Brandon looked at me for a brief moment, not with hatred, not with surprise, but with the expression of someone who finally understood that some battles are lost the moment a person chooses pride over listening. He turned away and walked out of Meridian Transit Systems, the first and last time he left without anyone clearing a path for him. Right after, Colton appeared at the corner of the hallway, looking like someone who had just lost control of the wheel. He avoided my eyes and rushed toward another elevator, each step weighted with fear, as if his future were being dragged down by the collapse of the CEO he had clung to for so long. No arrogance, no hostility, only the awkward silence of a man who knew his position was slipping. By noon, while I was sorting documents, Milo walked up beside my desk with a coffee cup, giving me a shy but genuine smile. "You're doing all right. I know things got big, but I am glad you held your ground." I laughed softly, feeling warmth for the first time in days. Emily appeared moments later, arms full of documents. She stopped at my desk and nodded. She spoke quietly, as if afraid someone would overhear. "Julia, I am glad the truth was heard. You did the right thing, and thank you for holding firm till the end." That small moment, Milo awkward but sincere, Emily composed but moved, felt like the invisible wall around me finally cracked. Early in the afternoon, an email from the board arrived, only one sentence. "Ms. Torres, please join the review team for the AeroLink acquisition file." I read it 3 times to make sure I was not mistaken. I was no longer the person making coffee, preparing packets, and setting meeting schedules. I was being invited to the table where real decisions were made. The review session began that same afternoon. I brought the file I had dissected for days and sat next to the legal and finance teams. No one looked at me like I did not belong. No one asked why a secretary was in the room. They asked for my input, truly asked. I pointed out 2 small errors in a subclause related to third-party system access and one unclear point in the algorithm maintenance fee structure. Each one could have cost the company millions if overlooked. The board noted every detail without interrupting or doubting. That was when I realized the skill I had thought was wasted was exactly what the company needed most. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Meridian changed noticeably. After the shock of the AeroLink incident, no one dared ignore the voices of lower-level staff anymore. Meetings opened more frequently. Employees were asked for input on procedural changes. It was not perfect or miraculous, but something real was shifting, and shifting in the right direction. One late afternoon, as I left a conference room, I stopped in the hallway and looked out at Chicago. The city stretched below like a glowing map, every car and every street alive with motion. I leaned on the glass railing and closed my eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, I did not feel swallowed by someone else's shadow. For the first time, I felt my value no longer dimmed by a job title or by the eyes of people who once dismissed me. I stood there, letting the breeze from the vent brush through my hair, and realized that although the road was far from over, I had stepped out of my own invisibility. And I knew whatever came next would not be fear. It would be the beginning of a new chapter. Less than a week after Brandon left the company, I was invited to another closed-door meeting with the board. This time, it was not to defend myself, not to justify anything. The voice of the board assistant was softer, gentler, as if in this conversation, I was no longer someone standing at the edges. I stepped into the large room on the 40th floor, and this time it did not feel as cold as before. The dark leather chairs were the same, the solemn oval table the same, but the eyes of the board were different. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. Richard Monroe, the board chair, spoke first. "Julia, recent events revealed something very clearly. This company has relied too heavily on its old power structure, and that nearly drove us into a disaster. We intend to change that, and we believe you are the person who can lead that change." I sat still for a moment, unsure of what his words meant until he placed a document in front of me. Director of Contract Strategy and Risk Management, a position that had never existed at Meridian, a role between legal and strategy, ensuring every major deal was properly reviewed, risks mitigated, and most important, an independent voice separate from the executive chain. I looked down at the page, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from astonishment. I had never imagined that the company where I once felt invisible would ask me to step into a role requiring such clarity, judgment, and backbone. Richard continued, "We chose you for 3 reasons. 1, you understand contracts better than people who are paid a great deal to do it. 2, you held your ground even under pressure. And 3, you demonstrated integrity in a situation where no one else had the courage." I took a deep breath, wondering if I was dreaming. But what I felt was unmistakably real, clear, like a new door opening right in front of me. Still, I knew I would not accept the role simply because they wanted it. I needed actual authority. I looked up and said calmly, "I have one condition. I want the right to speak directly to the board whenever I identify a major risk, without going through the CEO or any other executive." The room went silent for a few seconds. I knew it was a bold request, one that would break the usual hierarchy of most corporations. But Richard nodded almost immediately. Condition accepted. I exhaled quietly. Not because I wanted power, but because the past had taught me the most important lesson. When the right voice is blocked by the wrong authority, the company will repeat its failures. On my first day in the new office, I did not sit down right away. I stood before the large window, looking out over Chicago, sprawling beneath me like a network of light both complex and defiant. This city had watched me go from an invisible secretary to the one who stood up when the entire company turned its back, and now the person entrusted with protecting the deals that would shape Meridian's future. It was not a corner office with leather sofas or a stocked bar like Brandon's, but it had morning light, room to think, and most importantly, a door that opened directly to the board when I needed it. I placed my folder on the desk, sat in the new chair, and touched the smooth wooden surface. Here, my breath did not tremble like the day I was mocked in front of 18 people. Here, there was no tightness in my chest from being told I did not have the standing to speak. I sat quietly for a moment, letting my mind drift through the memories that brought me to this place. The sting of being dismissed. The fear ran through me as I walked into the notary's office with $5 in my pocket. The moment my accounts were locked and HR sent their email, the icy wind on my face as I forced myself not to bow under pressure. Those painful moments had become the ground beneath my feet. I powered on my computer, slowly, steadily, ready to begin a new chapter. In that moment, I understood that my path was not one of power. It was a path of value. And value is not given. Value is proven. I smiled, a small but certain smile. This was not my ending. This was my beginning. And if I had to choose one lesson to carry forward from everything that happened, it was this. You do not need a high title to make an impact. You do not need power to be heard. You only need to stand up when someone tells you that you are not enough. The rest of time will prove on its own.